In the late 1990s, a self-improvement organization called NXIVM began attracting members across the United States. It promised leadership training, personal growth, and professional success. Thousands of people believed they had found a path toward a better life. Few realized that its founder was hiding a far darker agenda. Before we begin the full story, this channel takes hours of research and careful verification to bring you real crime stories that matter. We invest in tools, software, and time to ensure every detail is accurate and meaningful. If you support this work, help us reach 5,000 subscribers this week. Subscribe, like, share. Now back to the story. Keith Raniere presented himself as an intellectual and visionary leader. Followers admired his confidence and accepted his teachings without question. Many believed he possessed unique knowledge that could transform their lives. That carefully crafted image helped him gain extraordinary influence over members. NXIVM offered expensive seminars that encouraged members to overcome fears and reach their potential. Participants attended workshops, coaching sessions, and leadership programs. Many invested significant amounts of money and time in the organization. Their growing commitment made it harder to question its leadership. As members advanced within the organization, loyalty became increasingly important. They were encouraged to place the group's goals above their own needs. Critics were described as negative influences who failed to understand the mission. This environment discouraged members from questioning authority. Keith Raniere surrounded himself with trusted followers who helped recruit new members. Several senior members became responsible for organizing events and mentoring newcomers. They believed they were helping people improve their lives. Instead, many unknowingly supported an abusive system. Behind the public seminars, Raniere secretly created a hidden subgroup known as DOS. Membership was limited to selected women who believed they were joining an exclusive empowerment circle. The true purpose of the group was concealed from many recruits. Raniere controlled the organization through layers of secrecy. Women entering DOS were required to provide damaging personal information, private photographs, or financial documents as collateral. They were told the collateral demonstrated commitment and trust. It gave leaders powerful leverage over members. Many feared the material would be released if they left. Members were organized into a master and slave hierarchy that demanded complete obedience. Women were expected to follow strict instructions without hesitation. Some were required to perform unpaid labor and complete assignments at any hour. The structure increased Raniere's control over their daily lives. Many members were instructed to follow restrictive diets and maintain extremely low body weight. They often believed these demands were part of achieving discipline and personal growth. Investigators later concluded that these requirements strengthened psychological control. Members became increasingly dependent on approval from leaders. Several women were pressured into sexual relationships with Keith Raniere. Investigators later determined that consent was often undermined through manipulation, coercion, and abuse of authority. Some women believed refusing his demands would result in punishment or exposure of their collateral. These allegations became central to the criminal investigation. One of the most disturbing practices involved branding women with a heated cauterizing device. Members were told the mark represented commitment to the group. Many later said they were not fully informed about what the symbol actually represented. Investigators found that the branding was carried out under coercive circumstances. For years, many victims remained silent because they feared retaliation and public humiliation. The collateral they had surrendered made leaving the group feel dangerous. Some believed no one would believe their experiences. Others worried about protecting family members and their reputations. Eventually, several former members decided to speak publicly despite those fears. Their accounts described manipulation, branding, coercion, and sexual exploitation inside the secret organization. Journalists began comparing multiple testimonies and discovered consistent patterns of abuse. Public attention quickly shifted toward Keith Raniere and NXIVM. If you value true crime documentaries that focus on verified evidence and survivor testimony, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every victim who speaks out helps expose abuse that might otherwise remain hidden. Investigative journalists continued interviewing former members who independently described similar experiences. Their reporting brought national attention to the allegations against NXIVM. More victims gained the confidence to come forward. The growing number of consistent accounts strengthened public scrutiny. Federal authorities began examining financial records, witness statements, electronic communications, and organizational documents. Investigators carefully compared evidence from multiple victims. They focused on determining whether crimes had been committed rather than relying on rumors. The investigation expanded significantly as new evidence emerged. Former members provided investigators with messages, emails, photographs, and internal documents connected to DOS. These materials helped explain how women were recruited and controlled. Investigators identified repeated patterns rather than isolated incidents. The evidence supported claims of coercion and exploitation. Authorities concluded that Keith Raniere exercised control over DOS despite attempts to conceal his leadership. Witness testimony described how senior female members followed his instructions. Prosecutors argued that the secret structure existed to benefit Raniere personally. Evidence continued to build up against him. As the investigation intensified, several senior members faced increasing legal scrutiny. Investigators examined each person's role within the organization. They sought to determine who had recruited victims and enforced the group's rules. The case expanded beyond a single suspect. Raniere eventually left the United States while authorities continued their investigation. His departure attracted additional attention from law enforcement. Investigators worked with international partners to determine his location. The search soon led them outside the country. In March 2018, Mexican authorities working with the FBI located Keith Raniere in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. He was arrested and taken into custody without a violent confrontation. After his arrest, he was returned to the United States to face federal charges. The investigation entered its next phase as prosecutors prepared for trial. Federal prosecutors charged Raniere with multiple serious offenses related to racketeering, forced labor conspiracy, sex trafficking conspiracy, and other crimes. The indictment reflected years of investigative work and testimony from former members. Prosecutors continued gathering evidence as the case moved toward trial. Victims prepared to testify about their experiences. Several former members agreed to cooperate fully with investigators and prosecutors. Their testimony helped explain how fear, manipulation, and collateral were used to maintain control. Each witness added important details to the overall picture. The prosecution's case grew steadily stronger. Court filings revealed how psychological manipulation played a central role in the organization's operation. Prosecutors argued that victims were isolated, intimidated, and pressured into obedience. The evidence showed repeated patterns rather than isolated events. Investigators believed they had established a comprehensive case. As the trial approached, additional witnesses and documentary evidence continued supporting the government's allegations. Former members described similar experiences despite coming from different backgrounds. Prosecutors emphasized the consistency of these accounts. The courtroom would ultimately decide the outcome. Jury selection began as prosecutors finalized their presentation of evidence against Keith Raniere. Witnesses prepared to testify about coercion, branding, collateral, and exploitation inside DOS. The trial would determine whether prosecutors had proved the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Years of investigation were about to be tested in federal court. The federal trial against Keith Raniere began in New York, with prosecutors presenting testimony from former members and documentary evidence. Witnesses described how women were recruited into DOS through promises of empowerment before facing coercion and abuse. Prosecutors argued that Raniere directed the group's activities while concealing his leadership. The defense denied the allegations and claimed the relationships were consensual. If you appreciate fact-based true crime stories that explain both the investigation and the courtroom evidence, subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue telling real cases with accuracy and respect for the victims. Former DOS members testified that they were required to surrender damaging collateral before joining the secret group. They explained how this material was used to pressure them into remaining obedient. Several witnesses described living in constant fear that their private information would be released. Their testimony became a central part of the prosecution's case. Witnesses also described strict rules governing their daily lives, including demanding schedules and severe dietary restrictions. Prosecutors argued that these rules increased psychological dependence on the organization. Former members explained how questioning authority often resulted in punishment or humiliation. The jury heard consistent accounts from multiple witnesses. Several women testified that they had been pressured into sexual relationships with Keith Raniere through manipulation and abuse of authority. Prosecutors argued that genuine consent had been undermined by coercion and fear. Defense attorneys challenged portions of the testimony during cross-examination. The jury was left to evaluate the credibility of each witness. Evidence presented during the trial included electronic messages, emails, photographs, financial records, and internal NXIVM documents. Prosecutors argued that these materials supported the witnesses' accounts. The evidence showed repeated patterns of control rather than isolated incidents. The government's case became increasingly difficult to dispute. Former members described the branding ceremonies conducted within DOS. They testified that they had not been fully informed about the nature or meaning of the branding before it occurred. Prosecutors argued that the ceremonies demonstrated the organization's coercive practices. The testimony deeply affected those present in the courtroom. Investigators explained how they had gathered evidence over several years before making arrests. They interviewed numerous former members and compared independent accounts of abuse. Digital communications and organizational records helped verify important details. The investigation relied on both witness testimony and physical evidence. Federal prosecutors argued that Raniere used manipulation, intimidation, and deception to maintain control over followers. They presented evidence that women were recruited into DOS through trusted members before learning its true purpose. Prosecutors described the organization as a criminal enterprise rather than a self-improvement group. The trial focused on proving those allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. Several former senior members chose to cooperate with federal investigators during the case. Their testimony helped explain the internal structure of NXIVM and DOS. Prosecutors argued that this cooperation strengthened the evidence against Raniere. The jury received a detailed picture of how the organization operated. After weeks of testimony, prosecutors completed their presentation of evidence. The defense attempted to challenge witness credibility and the interpretation of certain communications. Both sides summarized their arguments before the jury. Deliberations then began. In June 2019, the jury found Keith Raniere guilty on multiple federal charges, including racketeering, sex trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, forced labor conspiracy, and wire fraud conspiracy. The verdict followed weeks of testimony from former members and extensive documentary evidence. Prosecutors described the outcome as justice for the victims who had spoken out. The case then moved to sentencing. In October 2020, the federal court sentenced Keith Raniere to 120 years in prison. The judge concluded that his crimes caused profound and lasting harm to numerous victims. The sentence ensured that Raniere would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. Victims later addressed the court about the impact of his actions. Several high-ranking NXIVM members also faced criminal charges for their roles in the organization. Some pleaded guilty and received prison sentences after cooperating with investigators. Others were convicted following separate legal proceedings. The prosecutions reflected the broader accountability sought in the case. The investigation succeeded because survivors chose to come forward despite fear and intimidation. Journalists, federal investigators, and prosecutors carefully examined evidence before bringing charges. Their combined efforts exposed years of abuse hidden behind promises of self-improvement. The case demonstrated the importance of listening to victims and following the evidence. I know you still haven't subscribed, so press the red button now, because the next real crime story could be even darker. Subscribe for more shocking investigations, courtroom mysteries, hidden evidence, and true crime cases that reveal the darkest side of human nature. The NXIVM case attracted worldwide attention because it showed how manipulation can exist behind respectable public images. Many members joined seeking education, confidence, or career growth rather than criminal activity. Investigators concluded that trust had been systematically exploited over many years. The organization's public reputation concealed its hidden abuses. Law enforcement agencies emphasized that psychological coercion can be as powerful as physical force. Investigators examined how fear, dependency, and collateral influenced victims' decisions. This evidence helped explain why many members remained in the organization. The case broadened public understanding of coercive control. Former members have continued sharing their experiences to educate others about manipulative organizations. Many have participated in interviews, documentaries, and public discussions. Their stories have helped others recognize warning signs of coercion. Public awareness remains one of the lasting outcomes of the case. Legal experts have pointed to the NXIVM prosecution as an example of building a complex case through patient investigation. Prosecutors relied on witness testimony, supported by electronic records and documentary evidence. The combination strengthened the government's case before the jury. Careful preparation proved essential to the successful prosecution. The case also demonstrated the importance of investigative journalism. Early reporting encouraged additional former members to contact authorities with new information. Those accounts expanded the investigation and strengthened the evidence. Cooperation between survivors and investigators became a turning point. The federal conviction sent a clear message that organizations cannot hide criminal conduct behind self-help programs. Courts held leaders accountable when evidence established coercion and exploitation. The legal process focused on documented facts rather than public speculation. Justice depended on thorough investigation and credible testimony. Many victims have described rebuilding their lives after leaving NXIVM. Recovery required time, support, and distance from the organization's influence. Some chose to speak publicly, so others could avoid similar manipulation. Their resilience remains an important part of the story. The investigation highlighted how difficult it can be for victims of coercive groups to seek help. Fear, shame, and psychological pressure often delayed reports to law enforcement. Investigators worked to understand those barriers while gathering evidence. Their approach encouraged more witnesses to cooperate. Today, the NXIVM case is studied by investigators, legal experts, and psychologists interested in coercive organizations. It illustrates how manipulation, secrecy, and abuse can develop gradually over time. The evidence presented in court continues to inform discussions about exploitation and victim protection. Its lessons remain relevant around the world. The courage of former members ultimately changed the course of the investigation. Their willingness to testify allowed prosecutors to establish patterns of manipulation and abuse. Combined with documentary evidence, their accounts led to successful convictions. Their actions helped ensure accountability through the justice system. Keith Raniere built NXIVM as a self-improvement organization, but secretly used his authority to manipulate, exploit, and control vulnerable members through the hidden DOS subgroup. Federal investigators, supported by survivor testimony, documentary evidence, and years of investigative work, exposed the criminal enterprise and brought the case to trial. A federal jury convicted Raniere on multiple charges, and the court sentenced him to 120 years in prison, while several senior associates also received criminal convictions or pleaded guilty for their roles. The case remains a powerful reminder that persistent survivors, careful investigations, and strong evidence can bring even the most influential abusers to justice. If justice still matters to you, subscribe and stand with us, because silence helps criminals. Every story deserves to be heard. Every victim deserves justice. Stay aware. Stay safe.